It is a Monday morning in the mid-1700s. The chill in the air hasn't kept the crowds away. Down in the bowels of Newgate prison, a cart is being readied for a grim procession. 6 men and 2 women stand in irons, hands bound behind their backs. Halters, simple hemp ropes looped into slip knots, are already tied around their necks. There's no ceremony. Every step onto the cart is a step they will not walk back. Outside Newgate, the street is already lined with people. Estimates for Tyburn execution crowds vary, but on busy days, tens of thousands would gather. Some accounts suggest up to 100,000. Vendors shout the price of pies, tripe and gin. Ballad sellers wave broadsheets with the condemned's confessions. Pickpockets work the throng, making a day's wage from the pockets of spectators. Young boys climb lampposts for a better view. Wealthier Londoners rent rooms along the route. It is a carnival wrapped around a spectacle of death. The cart rolls forward. At St Sepulchre's church, the bell tolls. This same bell traditionally rings at midnight to warn the condemned to prepare for death. Now it rings again as the cart passes, and the church's minister leans from the window to offer a final admonition. Further along, the cart halts near St Giles in the fields, at an inn known as the Bowl Inn. Here the prisoners are offered what locals call the hanging ale, one last drink. A last draught at this stop would later inspire the expression "on the wagon," a reference to the wagon driver declining a drink so he can drive the condemned safely to Tyburn. After this brief respite, the cart creaks onto what is now Oxford Street. The crowd thickens. Hawkers sell cakes and beer. Some jeer and throw refuse. Others whisper prayers. Ahead stands a triangular structure of 3 tall uprights connected by cross beams, the Tyburn Tree. Built in 1571, the triple gallows can support up to 8 bodies on each beam. On at least one occasion, 24 prisoners were executed at once. Though most days the numbers are smaller, still the image of 8 bodies dropping together is shocking. The condemned climb onto the flatbed cart beneath the beams. The hangman adjusts each noose behind the left ear and asks if they have final words. Some pray, others defiantly address the crowd. A few joke, trying to stay calm. When the driver cracks his whip, the horse lurches forward and the cart rolls out. There is no long drop. They hang suspended, choking, legs kicking. Friends or family may tug at their legs to hasten death. Faces darken, tongues protrude, rope bites skin. Death by strangulation can take 10 to 20 minutes. This is not designed to be quick. It is meant to be seen, heard, and felt by the city. As the bodies twist, some in the crowd cheer, others watch silently, gripping their children's hands. The spectacle is both deterrent and entertainment. One observer called the gallows a deadly nevergreen because it bore fruit all year long. When the struggling stops, the hangman climbs up and cuts down the bodies. Friends may claim the corpse, or surgeons may claim it for dissection. Pieces of rope are sold as souvenirs, a little extra cash for the hangman. The crowd disperses, leaving him to tidy the beams for the next scheduled execution. This isn't a one-off horror. Between the 12th century and 1783, an estimated 40,000 to 60,000 people were executed at Tyburn. Among them were petty thieves, highwaymen, forgers, rebels, and religious martyrs. The Monday you've just heard is one among hundreds. The question is not whether it happened, but how such a system endured for centuries, and why it finally came to an end. The name Tyburn comes from a small brook that once flowed near a hamlet outside London. By the 12th century, the area was already being used for executions. Over time, the city spread westward. By the 1700s, the gallows stood near the crossroads of what are now Edgware Road, Oxford Street, and Park Lane, close to today's Marble Arch. Travellers called the highway leading there the Tyburn Road long before anyone spoke of Oxford Street. It was the public face of English criminal law. One of the first prominent men hanged at Tyburn was William Fitz-Osbert, known as Longbeard, who led a popular uprising against wealthy London merchants in 1196. When he was captured, he and several followers were dragged to Tyburn and hanged. By the late 16th century, Tyburn had become London's primary execution site. Court records from the 1570s list more than 700 felons, about 704 individuals, executed there in that decade alone. Their crimes ranged from theft to coining, poaching, highway robbery, and the papist offences of refusing to acknowledge the monarch as head of the church. More than 100 Catholics executed at Tyburn between 1535 and 1681. are remembered as the Tyburn martyrs. Their deaths give the place a dual identity, a site of punishment and a shrine to conscience. The gallows itself evolved. Early executions were carried out on a simple wooden beam. In 1571, authorities replaced it with a triangular scaffold of 3 uprights connected by cross beams. The design allowed multiple prisoners to be hanged simultaneously. Each crossbeam could accommodate up to 8 nooses. At least once, in 1649, all 3 beams were used at full capacity to hang 24 people. More often, 3 to 8 prisoners were executed together. People called it the Tyburn Tree because the 3 posts looked like a tree's branches. Printmakers dubbed it a nevergreen because its fruit, hanged bodies, never stopped appearing. In 1759, the fixed structure was dismantled and replaced with a portable gallows. After 1783, executions were moved to Newgate prison, but for more than 2 centuries this triangular scaffold was a symbol of state power and a warning to all who passed. By the early 18th century, English criminal law had expanded dramatically. Around 1688, there were roughly 50 capital offences. Over the next century, Parliament added more than 100 statutes prescribing death. For stealing a handkerchief worth more than a shilling, for cutting down a tree, for damaging a fish pond, for poaching a deer, for appearing armed with a blackened face. The so-called bloody code meant that petty theft and violent murder could both end at the same rope. In practice, juries often refused to convict when a death sentence seemed disproportionate. They undervalued stolen goods to save defendants. But the threat was always there. Tyburn was the factory where the bloody code sentences were carried out. It made visible both the law's severity and its arbitrariness. The triple gallows was also theatre. It stood at the city's edge, surrounded by open fields that could hold crowds. In prints and broadsides, the structure resembles a tree bearing bodies as fruit. The triangle became a shape of fear. Writers and preachers exploited the image. One sermon called the structure the nevergreen tree whose fruit are men's sins. Children played games about the Tyburn jig, the dance of death at the end of a rope. The same beams that held pickpockets also bore rebels and martyrs. What does it say about a society when a stolen handkerchief and a mass murderer swing from the same wood? When cutting down a tree and cutting a throat draw the same rope tight, the Tyburn Tree forces us to ask those questions. Executions in London were scheduled on 8 set Mondays each year. After sentence, prisoners were confined in the condemned hold beneath Newgate's press yard. The air stank of sweat, lime wash, and fear. In those dark cells, they awaited the morning when the yeoman of the halter would unlock the door, remove their leg irons, and place a halter around each neck, a rope that was, for the moment, more leash than noose. The Ordinary of Newgate, a minister, visited them, urging confession and repentance. He kept detailed notes and later published them as the Ordinary's accounts, pamphlets recounting crimes, confessions, and final speeches. These were sold at the scaffold. The condemned sometimes commissioned their own last dying speech and confession to raise money for family. Repentance, narrative, and commerce became tangled long before the cart left the prison yard. On execution day, the ritual unfolded like theatre. The cart carrying the prisoners rolled from Newgate onto Snow Hill and then along Holborn and St Giles High Street. People rented windows, taverns filled, hawkers sold gingerbread in the shape of hanged men, ballad sellers shouted summaries of the condemned's lives. At St Sepulchre's church the bell tolled, and the minister leaned from the window to admonish the prisoners. At St Giles the procession stopped at the Bowl Inn for hanging ale. Some drank to steady their nerves, others refused out of piety. According to one story, the phrase, "on the wagon," comes from the wagon driver's refusal of drink so he could drive the doomed cart. Each halt punctuated the journey, building tension. The halter around the neck reminded everyone what lay ahead. Friends and supporters followed behind, singing hymns or bawdy songs. Notorious criminals such as highwaymen turned the ride into theatre, bantering with the crowd. Common thieves sometimes received abuse. Some prisoners fainted along the way. Others were so drunk they had to be propped up. The yeoman of the halter sometimes had to clear a path through spectators, reaching out to touch the condemned as if they carried a contagious glamour. As the city thinned and fields opened, the Tyburn Tree came into view. Temporary stands had been erected for paying spectators. Surgeons, their students, and their agents hovered nearby to claim bodies for dissection. Under the Murder Act of 1752, the corpses of murderers could not be buried, but had to be dissected or hung in chains. Families sometimes fought surgeons to reclaim bodies. Ballad sellers read aloud the confessions of the condemned to attract buyers. Pickpockets moved through the crowd. The procession ended when the cart pulled beneath the triple gallows. The condemned climbed onto the cart. The ordinary offered a last prayer. The hangman adjusted the nooses. Then the horse moved and the cart rolled away. The road to Tyburn ended as abruptly as life itself. If the cold open gave you the sights and sounds, this act reveals the ritual's machinery. The condemned passed through stages: a church bell, a tavern ale, a printed confession, each reinforcing the idea that execution served justice and morality. But the same route also fostered disorder, drunkenness, pickpocketing, a marketplace of death. Was this truly meant to inspire repentance, or was it a parade designed to satisfy curiosity and sell copies? Even in the 18th century, people were starting to ask. The mechanics of hanging at Tyburn were simple yet brutal. There was no calculated drop to break the neck. Prisoners stood on a cart or ladder. When the horse moved, the cart rolled away, leaving them suspended. They died by strangulation. It could take anywhere from several minutes to 20. Because the process was slow, some begged friends or the hangman to pull their legs to hasten the end. Others endured each second with whatever dignity they could muster. The triple gallows was designed to maximize efficiency. Multiple prisoners could be hanged with one pull. Observers described the gallows as a machine. Prisoners were processed, hanged, and removed with mechanical regularity. After the bodies stopped kicking, the hangman cut them down, removed the nooses, and reset the ropes for the next group. The hangman, often called Jack Ketch, was a salaried officer but relied on gratuities. Condemned men and their families tipped him to make the suffering shorter. Pieces of rope cut from around a hanged neck were sold as lucky charms. The hangman's perquisites also included the clothes of the executed. The yeoman of the halter placed the ropes around the necks and led the prisoners. His title helped fix the phrase "a halter round his neck" as shorthand for being condemned. Around this scaffold, an entire economy thrived. Ballad sellers printed lurid accounts of crimes and sold them on sight. Hawkers offered gingerbread men shaped like hanging bodies. Vendors sold beer, pies, and gin. Broadsides, single-sheet ballads, included details of the crime and the condemned's last words, read aloud by sellers to drum up sales. Meanwhile, pickpockets worked the crowd with impunity. Critics argued that the execution fare fostered vice rather than repentance. The Murder Act of 1752 required the bodies of murderers to be dissected or hung in chains. Surgeons and their agents attended executions to claim bodies. Fights sometimes erupted when families tried to prevent dissection. The Anatomy Act of 1832 later provided a legal supply of bodies from workhouses and hospitals, reducing the need to seize corpses at the scaffold. Even in death, the condemned were part of a system, punishment, profit, and anatomy all intertwined. This execution factory posed a quiet problem. If punishment becomes routine, does anyone still feel its moral weight? When the gallows becomes as ordinary as a market stall, is the law losing its power to shock or doubling down on fear? Reformers argued that the theatre of death wasn't working. The Tyburn Tree would not fall overnight, but its days as a public machine were numbered. Behind every rope is a human story. The Tyburn Tree processed thousands, but a few stand out, not because of their crimes alone, but because of how they and the crowd responded. Jack Shepherd was born in 1702 into poverty and apprenticed as a carpenter. He drifted into theft and burglary, working with his girlfriend Elizabeth Lyon, known as Edgeworth Bess. His fame came not from his crimes, but from his escapes. In 1723, he broke out of St Giles's roundhouse by cutting through the roof. Later, he escaped Bridewell prison by chiseling through his cell wall, scaling the roof, and lowering himself using bedclothes. His most famous escape came in 1724 from Newgate's stone castle. He soared through his chains, squeezed up a chimney, crawled across the roof, and descended into the street with a rope. Each escape humiliated the authorities and delighted the public. Ballads celebrated him, prints showed him slipping through bars. For a time he became a folk hero, a symbol of the poor, outwitting the law. Thief-taker Jonathan Wild, who controlled much of London's criminal underworld, eventually betrayed Shepherd for a reward. Captured in a tavern at Finchley, Shepherd was taken back to Newgate. On 16th of November 1724, he rode the cart to Tyburn. An enormous crowd lined the route. Some estimates claim half of London's population. Women threw flowers. Vendors sold Shepherd caps and souvenirs. Daniel Defoe Ghost wrote his autobiography, which sold well at the scaffold. Shepherd, always theatrical, planned one last escape. His friends intended to cut him down quickly and resuscitate him. Such rescues had occasionally succeeded when a short drop left the victim unconscious, but not yet dead. For a few seconds he hung twitching, his friends counting under their breath, willing him to last long enough. But the crowd, unaware of the plan, surged forward and pulled on his legs to shorten his suffering. The plan failed. Shepherd died and was buried that night. Authorities later banned plays bearing his name, fearing they glorified crime. Shepherd's story shows how Tyburn could create anti-heroes and how the rope ultimately silenced them. From the 1530s through the 1680s, Catholic priests and their supporters faced death for treason. Under Henry VIII and Elizabeth I, it was treasonous to deny the monarch's supremacy over the church. More than 100 Catholics executed under these laws have been recognized as martyrs. Among them was Edmund Campion, a Jesuit priest. A brilliant Oxford scholar, Campion converted to Catholicism and joined the Society of Jesus. He returned to England secretly in 1580 to minister to underground Catholics. The government hunted him and captured him at Lyford Grange. He was imprisoned in the Tower of London, tortured and offered freedom if he would renounce his faith. He refused. In November 1581, he was tried for treason and convicted on dubious evidence. On 1st December 1581, Campion and 2 other priests were dragged on hurdles through muddy streets to Tyburn. The procession was different from the later Newgate to Tyburn ride. It was the traitor's punishment. At Tyburn, Campion spoke briefly, praying for his persecutors. He was then hanged until nearly dead, cut down, disemboweled and quartered, the full traitor's death. His courage inspired at least one onlooker. Henry Walpole, splashed with Campion's blood, converted on the spot, and later became a Jesuit priest and martyr. Campion was not alone. In 1535, Carthusian prior John Houghton and several companions refused to sign Henry VIII's Act of Supremacy. They too were brought to Tyburn, hanged, cut down alive, and disemboweled. For Catholics, the Nevergreen Tree became a site of witness. For the state, it was a tool to make an example of conscience. The same beams that held thieves also bore men who were later canonized as saints. While most who died at Tyburn were poor, the rope could reach the nobility. Lawrence Shirley, 4th Earl Ferrers, was notorious for his violent temper. In 1760, he shot and killed his steward. As a peer, he was tried by the House of Lords. He attempted to plead insanity, citing a family history of madness. The Lords rejected his defense and sentenced him to hang. His execution differed from that of common criminals. Instead of an open cart, Ferrers traveled from the Tower of London to Tyburn in his own coach. The scaffold was draped in black in deference to his rank. Unlike the usual short drop, he was hanged using a device with trapdoors, an early drop mechanism. Rumor said he requested a silk rope. Although unproven, the details stuck. A nobleman worrying about the rope that would break his neck. After his death, his body was dissected and buried. Ferrers' case illustrates 2 things. First, even a peer could find himself under the same beams as pickpockets and highwaymen. Second, his execution previewed the move toward a longer, calculated drop, an attempt to make hanging quicker and, in theory, more humane. The crowd came not just to see a lord die, but to see the machinery of death evolve. These 3 stories, the folk hero, the martyr, and the peer, show Tyburn's paradox. It was both a leveler and a stage. It could produce heroes, saints, and villains. The crowd cheered Shepherd, prayed for Campion, gawked at Ferrers. Does the rope truly treat everyone the same, or do class and faith color how we remember them? When the same gallows serves as scaffold, shrine, and theater, what exactly is justice? By the mid-18th century, public attitudes toward Tyburn were changing. Critics argued that the spectacle encouraged vice rather than deterring crime. Reports of pickpockets operating under the gallows and drunken brawls near the cart made the rituals look grotesque. Jurists like William Blackstone pointed out that certainty of punishment, not severity, deterred crime. Reformers like Sir Samuel Romilly introduced bills to remove the death penalty from dozens of property offences. Judges and juries were already quietly rebelling. Jurors undervalued stolen goods to avoid sending petty thieves to the rope. Practical problems compounded moral qualms. The route from Newgate to Tyburn wound through busy streets. London's population was growing, making crowd control difficult. Soldiers were needed to keep order. Fights broke out between surgeons' agents and the families of the condemned. Authorities worried that crowds of tens of thousands could riot. The government concluded that public executions, as they were conducted at Tyburn, were no longer practical. In 1783, they moved London executions from Tyburn to a scaffold outside Newgate prison. The last person to ride the full route was highwayman John Austin on 3rd of November 1783. After his death, the triple gallows was dismantled. The move to Newgate shortened the procession and removed the fairground element. It allowed city authorities to exert more control, but it did not immediately end the public spectacle. Crowds still gathered outside Newgate. Hangmen continued to use the short drop into the 19th century. Over the next decades, Parliament reduced the number of capital crimes. The Judgment of Death Act 1823 gave judges discretion to commute many death sentences. Penal transportation to Australia offered an alternative. By 1861, only 5 crimes carried the death penalty. By 1868, public executions were abolished. The Treason Act 1870 formally ended the gruesome ritual of being hanged, drawn, and quartered. The long drop, developed by hangmen like William Marwood, replaced slow strangulation. Executions moved behind prison walls. The Tyburn Tree's time was over, but its echo remained. Today, the site near Marble Arch is marked by a plaque. The brook from which Tyburn takes its name has long been buried. Most pedestrians pass without noticing. The triple gallows exists only in memory and in phrases. Dancing the Tyburn jig still means hanging. But the debates that swirled around the Tyburn Tree did not disappear. They resurfaced whenever the state displayed its power in public, in arguments over press coverage of executions, the moral purpose of punishment, and the balance between justice and mercy. Tyburn's story reminds us that legal systems change. The Bloody Code gave way to reforms, the execution factory closed. Yet the questions remain: does spectacle deter or degrade? Who benefits when punishment becomes performance? And how will our own practices look to future generations? For more than 6 centuries, Londoners lived with a public execution factory at their city's western edge. The Tyburn Tree stood as a symbol of state power and social control. It turned punishment into routine and created a spectacle that drew crowds from every class. The Bloody Code that fed it reflected a belief that fear and visibility prevented crime. But the same spectacle exposed contradictions. Pickpockets worked beneath the beams. Ballad sellers profited from death. Surgeons fought relatives over corpses. Religious martyrs transformed the gallows into a place of witness. Folk heroes like Jack Sheppard turned it into a stage. Even a peer of the realm could not avoid it. Tyburn's machine processed them all. The end of Tyburn did not end the debate over punishment. Shifting executions to Newgate and later inside prison walls removed the carnival. But questions remain. Does public punishment deter or encourage crime? How do we balance justice with humanity? What is the purpose of making punishment visible? The law evolves with social values. The Bloody Code, once thought necessary, came to be seen as barbaric. Today we still wrestle with the role of punishment, rehabilitation, and spectacle. The crowds have dispersed, the gallows are gone, but the echoes remain. If you found this story compelling, consider subscribing to the Darkest Archives. We uncover forgotten crimes, examine historical trials, and explore the darker corners of justice and consequence. New episodes are released weekly. Until next time.